I'd like to start off today by asking you all a question. And that is, how do you respond when you feel angry? Anger is likely one of those things that you think of as being purely negative, something that really shouldn't have any part in our lives. But anger is something that is a natural response, something that we all experience, that we all feel. And anger is actually something that God even associates as being part of his character. Although God says that his anger is a slow anger. And God doesn't shy away from the fact that anger is part of his character. When he revealed himself to Moses, he said that he was slow to anger. That was part of who he is. So if God is identified as being slow to anger, if that's part of his character, then how should we think about anger ourselves? How should we react when we feel upset, when our anger is triggered? Well, first, I'd like to actually look at some of the physiology behind anger, because anger is much more than what just goes on within our mind. Anger impacts our entire body. So anger, as you might be aware, it's one of the fight or flight triggers of the body. When we are stressed, when we identify a threat to ourselves, to our physical well-being or our emotional well-being, we trigger a lot of hormones that end up flowing through the body and surging as we end up getting adrenaline and noradrenaline and cortisol. And all of this is done as a means to prepare our body. It ends up increasing our heart rate. It causes our breaths to increase, and our blood pressure increases, which is why we typically think of someone who's really angry being red in the face, because blood is being pushed to our extremities as we're preparing for that conflict, whether or not we're going to fight, or whether or not we're going to flee. And all of this is part of the body's natural response mechanism to defend ourselves. But this can also compromise our ability to think, because as our amygdala in our brain is causing all of these hormones to flood through our body, it ends up interfering with our prefrontal cortex. So our ability to actually judge a situation is compromised. So that's where it's important to understand that while anger is something that can be used as a means to physically protect ourselves, it also ends up putting us in a compromised state. That's why it's important that we learn how to slow down, how to pause, and think, why am I feeling this way? Why am I reacting this way? And that's easier said than done. I think probably all of us could say we've said things and done things when we were upset that we later regretted. But that's why it's so clear that we try to slow down and let those emotions subside a bit before we actually decide how we're going to react. If we read in James chapter 1, verse 19, James writes, "This you know, my beloved brethren, but everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God." Here, James is not saying that anger should have no part in us. He's not saying we should deny that physiological response of our bodies, but he is saying we need to be slow. We need to control those emotions. We need to practice in those stressful situations, regaining control of our mind. And once we've been able to calm down, we can then actually begin to stop and assess the situation, to think about what it was that triggered us. Were we actually physically threatened and trying to protect ourselves? Or did someone just hurt our pride? Did someone just press our button in a way that triggered us for some other reason? Perhaps because they treated us rudely, or perhaps because someone just inconvenienced us. In Proverbs 19, verse 11, we read that a man's discretion makes him slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook a transgression. Anger is something that tends to want us to get even and to find a balance of right and justice. But here in Proverbs, we read that it is a man's glory to overlook a transgression. So by doing that, by actually pausing, by actually overlooking what someone might have done to offend us, we're then giving God the opportunity. If God decides that justice is needed, then we can lay that into his hands. So now I'd actually like to look at the life of David, because David actually has a remarkable change in the course of his life in terms of how he deals with anger. And we see this from two stories. So first, we'll start in 1 Samuel chapter 25. And this is a time early in David's life when he was fleeing from Saul, and he was in the wilderness. But this was before he was king. And at this time, David so happened to have been watching Nabal's flock, because his men were in the wilderness and the flocks were there, so they decided that they could lend a hand and protect these flocks of Nabal, who was a very wealthy man. And in this story, a festival was coming up, and David felt like, oh, maybe I'll reach out to Nabal and see if he can give us some food so we can enjoy in the festivities. So David sends his men, and they greet Nabal in peace and ask for this favor. Picking up the story in 1 Samuel 25, verse 10, we read, "But Nabal answered David's servants and said, 'Who is David? And who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants who are each breaking away from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have slaughtered for my shears and give it to men of whose origin I do not know?' So David's young men retraced their way back, and they came and told him according to all these words. David then said to his men, 'Each of you gird on his sword.' So each man girded on his sword. And David also girded on his sword, and about 400 men went up behind David, while 200 stayed with the baggage." If we read then in verse 21, "Now David had said, 'Surely in vain I have guarded all that this man has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, and he has returned me evil for good.'" Here we see that David was really upset. He was triggered by multiple factors here. It appears that David was both insulted by Nabal, denying the fact that he had any recollection of who David was, even though he had defeated Goliath and led the armies of Israel. And also, David felt like he was owed something. He had done a favor. He felt like he was owed a favor in return. So that sense of right was also being violated within him. But here, he was going to an extreme of grabbing his sword and seeking vengeance for himself. And thankfully, Nabal's wife, Abigail, ended up interceding and stepping in, giving David the food and the gifts that he asked for. And she apologized on behalf of her husband for his insolence and even put the blame upon herself. And we pick up the story then, continuing in 1 Samuel 25, verse 32. "Then David said to Abigail, 'Blessed be the Lord God of Israel who sent you to me this day. And blessed be your discernment, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from bloodshed and from avenging myself by my own hand. Nevertheless, as the Lord God of Israel lives, who has restrained me from harming you, unless you had come quickly to meet me, surely there would not have been left of Nabal until the morning light as much as one male.' So David received from her hand what she had brought him, and said to her, 'Go to your house in peace. See, I have listened to you and granted your request.'" Here we see in this story that David was quick to react, and he was on the edge of committing a horrible crime had he not been stopped, because he was still thinking emotionally. He was still thinking in terms of justifying and avenging himself. He wasn't thinking, rightfully, in terms of whether or not it was really his responsibility to seek justice. And later in the story, Nabal ends up actually dying 10 days later in God's hands, not by the hands of David. This story helps to illustrate how we can so easily be triggered when our pride is hurt, when our sense of right is hurt. It can cause us to do some unimaginable things if we don't give ourselves enough time to slow down and assess the situation properly. So next, I'd like to look at a counterexample much later in David's life. And this is in 2 Samuel chapter 16. And in this account, David is now in his 60s. He's near the end of his reign as king. At this point, he is fleeing from his son, Absalom, who is trying to take the throne from him. So reading in 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 5, we read, When King David came to Bahurim, behold, there came out of there a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. He came out cursing continually as he came. He threw stones at David and at all the servants of King David, and all the people and all the mighty men were at his right hand and at his left. Continuing in verse 9, Then Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, said to the king, Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go now and cut off his head. But the king said, What have I to do with you, O sons of Zeruiah? If he curses, and if the Lord has told him to curse David, then who should say, Why have you done so? Then David said to Abishai and to all the servants, Behold, my son, who came from me, now seeks my life. How much more now this Benjamite? Let him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him. Perhaps the Lord will look on my affliction and return good to me instead of his cursing this day. So David and his men went on their way, and Shimei went along on the hillside parallel to him. And as he went, he cursed and cast stones and threw dust at him. In this instance, David wasn't just insulted. He was cursed to his face. And he was also being physically threatened. Can you imagine stones being thrown at your head and dust being cast in your eyes? And yet David's reaction here is remarkably different. Here, David is the one actually standing in defense of this man. And David had an armed guard all around him. He could have defended his own pride. He could have defended the monarchy. And yet instead, he used that as an opportunity to exercise slowness to his anger, to slow down, and to overlook the transgression and the offense that was caused against him. And imagine if every time we were offended or insulted or angered by someone else, if we took the position of saying, perhaps God decided to have them treat me this way as a means to test me, to teach me something, how much would that change our lives? So to conclude, anger is something that is a natural response. It's something that we all experience as an emotion, but we need to control that emotion. And we need to continually focus on practicing how we respond, to be slow to speak, to be slow to our anger. And when we are facing a situation where we feel like our sense of right is being violated, we need to remember that God is our judge and that he is the one who will bring vengeance. And it might be hard for us to really step back, and especially when we feel like we need to engage, we need to defend ourselves. If we are going to then yield, that might feel like a weakness in us. And yet, if we read in Proverbs 16, verse 32, we read that he who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who captures his city.